Hi everyone, thank you for joining us and for inviting me to speak with you today. I'm honoured to share some thoughts and track the journey of a fantastic new replica Roman distance sculpture that's now gracing the wall at Glasgow Bridge in Old Kilpatrick. This is one of the outcomes of the Rediscovering the Antonine Wall project, which has produced 5 replica distance sculpture that originally came from the Antonine Wall here in Scotland. But first, I thought it may be quite useful to provide some geographical, chronological, and some cultural context into which these unique monuments sit. Now, as the name suggests, these are a collection of sculptures that have been recovered from along the Antonine Wall, and that is the Roman Empire's most northwesterly frontier. Now, this was a massive monument that cleaved a route through the central belt of Scotland, right across the Clyde Forth Isthmus. Now, along the wall there were 17 forts constructed, as we can see here, and interspersed between those forts were a series of smaller fortlets and watchtowers. So, to put the wall into its wider geographical and its strategic importance, it's highlighted here at the top left of your screen as one segment of part of a protected UNESCO World Heritage Site entitled Frontiers of the Roman Empire, which stretches across several countries. Now, the region that we currently know as Scotland saw several incursions from the Roman army, dating all the way from the 1st through to the 4th century CE. Now, the period that we, of course, are particularly interested in is the sort of early to middle 2nd century, when the Emperor Antoninus Pius commissioned the construction of this mural barrier around 142. And to give you an idea of how the forts I mentioned a moment ago along the wall looked, this is Rough Castle. It's in fact in Falkirk, and it's pretty much the best preserved fort along the wall. We can see the outline of the fort here, and then there's some annex buildings or some annexes over to the side here. So it's a kind of complex, if you like, of different features sitting along the wall that we can just about make out on the top there. Now, this aerial shot hopefully provides a wider geographical perspective and setting of Rough Castle Fort, which is just down on the left now here, in its setting with the remains of the Antonine Wall. So what we have effectively is, on the south we have the Roman controlled area, and to the north we have, as the Romans would have called them, wild barbarian northerners who had been potentially quite hostile to that incoming Roman military force. And then down the centre we have the Antonine Wall remains. And we'll go over that in a bit more detail in a moment. But after a long period when knowledge of the wall had actually fallen completely out of memory, its antiquarian rediscovery prompted the General William Roy to record its surviving features and remains of forts in great detail in his military map of Scotland, dating to 1793. And so what this does is it gives us a really fantastic overview of plans of all the surviving fort remains along the wall, and you can see that all of them are actually quite different in character, but they do survive well up until that point, and it's a very useful historic document and resource and record really of these standing remains in the late 18th century. On the bottom we even have some really interesting profiles of the wall. That is a sideways view, if you like, of the terrain into which the forts sat. But there's long been interest in the Antonine Wall since the antiquarian times, and in fact the Glasgow Archaeological Society in particular was very prolific in undertaking investigations and excavations along it, and helping it really to augment our understanding of the wall and the features along it, as well as the installations along it. So maintaining that Rough Castle Fort connection we had a moment ago, here we have members of the Glasgow Historical Society at Rough Castle Fort dating to the 19th century. And the astute amongst you might notice that actually on the left here we have a woman, which is quite an unusual event of the day to see women involved in these activities. And we also have a couple of children in this photograph as well, which is great to see some young people, even in those days, being interested in their heritage. So the Antonine Wall differs very markedly from its predecessor and neighbour to the south that doubtless many of you are very familiar with, Hadrian's Wall. And unlike Hadrian's Wall, the Antonine Wall was not constructed of stone, but in fact it was constructed of large turf slabs that were laid atop of each other, and that stretched to somewhere between 3 to 4 metres high, and that's roughly a minimum of 20 turfs deep. And we can just see that in profile here in this section of the wall that's been cut through, and all of these kind of squared off rectangular features that we see, it gives us a really clear and interesting understanding of the stratigraphy of the layers upon which all of these turfs sat and constructed the wall. But actually we speak a lot about the wall. In fact, the wall was only one feature of an infrastructure of connected elements. And these elements include the turf rampart, which we see here in remain, which is the wall itself. And as I mentioned, that stood to a height of between 3 and 4 metres, and that was inclusive of a stone base. We'll talk a bit about that a little bit more in a moment. So immediately to the north of that we have the berm, which is a platform that separated the wall from the deep ditch. It was a deep 5 metre V-cut ditch, which is often referred to as an ankle breaker, and we can see why that is potentially the nomenclature for this very Roman characteristic ditch, which is a very, very sharp incline with a ending in a very sharp V at the bottom. As I say, very characteristic of Roman ditches. Immediately to the north of that ditch you'll see the upcast mound, and that was constructed of the spoil from the ditch. But one feature that is very rarely discussed but should really be considered an equally essential part of that infrastructure is the military way. And that sits on the south of the wall or in the Roman controlled part of the frontier. A little bit more of that later. But taken together, all of these features really created a sequence of defensive elements against which any incursions from these northern barbarians, as Roman writers would have termed these local hostile people. So I guess we could say it's a bit like a modern day Ironman obstacle course, if you like, that some people actually now do for fun. Not me, but I know colleagues who actually spend their weekends doing this. And I just wanted to show you how this type of activity really demonstrates what it might have been like trying to navigate and get over that really muddy feature of a wall back in the day, which would not have been a pleasant experience, and you would have had a lot of obstacles to overcome to get to that point. And here, just to give you maybe a better understanding of the construction phases of the wall, we can see the illustration here of the ditch being cut. The legions are discussing the best way to undertake their activities. Just to the north of that, at the berm, we can see these oblong-shaped holes in the ground. They are lilia, which are effectively another set of obstacles. They would have had these really sharp, sharpened wooden sticks pointing out of them, probably covered by bracken or other such bush type material to hide them, and they would have had, as I say, spikes embedded into them to create a very dangerous obstacle for any hostile northerners to try to navigate as they reach the wall, which itself may have had similar types of stakes protruding from it. On the top we potentially have a walkway, certainly where the forts were located, with some bastion up there, and on the right we can see a reconstruction of a gateway that would have been placed where the openings along the wall would have allowed the movement of people back and forth from the north into the south again. And just to give you even a better idea of how that wall base was constructed, here are the foundations at Bearsden Fort in Old Kilpatrick. And as I say, they give us a really interesting understanding and context for that very wide, 4 metre wide stone base that was required for that heavy turf wall to sit atop. We can even see that central ditch, a drainage ditch running through that there. And again, that drainage ditch coming up on the bottom of the screen, just to give you that overview of the structure that would have been at the base to hold the very heavy rampart on top. So getting back to our main topic of discussion today, the distance sculptures. Here is a map of their find spots in the vicinity of the wall. You'll see that many of them have been recovered from the western sector of the wall, and we'll discuss where the distance sculpture we're talking about today comes from in just a moment. So I thought it would be very useful to give you an idea of some of the distance sculptures that we have, and this is the Bridge Nest sculpture. It's perhaps the best known example of distance sculptures. It's now located in the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh, and it's a really beautifully preserved example of these unique monuments. And what it does is, I think it demonstrates really nicely that a familiar format that we have for them. Here we have a central inscription panel. Is flanked on either side by some really beautifully articulated iconography. Sometimes we also have these pelta on the side, which are shield-like shapes that frame on either side these types of central inscription panels, which are, as we see here, quite often framed with double-ribbed or single-ribbed frames. But actually, I wanted to draw your attention to the inscriptions themselves. Even those of you who are potentially familiar with Latin may not necessarily immediately recognise the text here as Latin, and that's because what we have is a very formulaic, abbreviated format of Latin that is very common to Roman inscriptions of the day. And from the Bridge Nest sculpture we can see the pattern of the abbreviated words that are common to all of our distance sculptures, along with the English translation. So just to very briefly state, the Latin abbreviated is Impses Tito Elio Hedre Antonino Og Pio PP Lig to Og Per, and then MP, lots of Roman numerals, and Fec. And that translates to for the Emperor Caesar Titus Aelius Hadrianus Antoninus Augustus Pius, to give the Emperor his full title. Father of his country, the Second Augustan Legion built this over a distance of 4,652 units of measure. So these sculptures actually served several purposes. They are dedications to the emperor, showing legionary loyalty primarily, but they also document the legions who were here building the frontier, and that is, as we know, the 2nd, the 6th and the 20th, and we know this because we have these inscriptions. They also tell us with that number at the bottom, which differs on different distance sculptures. So they tell us the length of the frontier that each of these legions were building, hence their nomenclature. But they also, in fact, provide some really graphic scenes of life on the frontier. So we have things like on the right, we can see a religious scene. Natural fact, what we're seeing is the legions undertaking a sacrificial ceremony. We also have other examples of deities, Roman deities, and also some military activities. So on the left, for example, we see quite a familiar scene from Roman frontier sculptures, which is a scene of battle. Here we have a Roman cavalryman who is riding down and in fact decapitating naked northern warriors in the heat of a very vicious battle. Now, another example of this type of sculpture, another distance sculpture, is the Summerston Farm piece on the bottom right here. But actually, we have a similar format, and in fact, you'll notice that on the left of the Summerston Farm, rather than that mid-battle scene on the bridge ness above, we have here now a post-battle scene where we have the northern warriors are now no longer in the heat of battle. They are now captives. We can see their arms are bound behind them. They're still naked. Their swords are scattered on the floor around them. Their shields are scattered around them. And the cavalryman is effectively guarding them whilst receiving honours from the goddess Victory, probably because of the celebration of his victory over these local warriors. But actually also these distance sculptures served as a form of propaganda insofar as they're demonstrating very visibly and visually the might and power and strength of Rome. And that's to various audiences, including Roman soldiers, communities who were followers of the Romans, in local vicus, what we call sort of small villages attached to some of the forts, but also to strike fear into local peoples who would have also engaged with them. So these are really very powerful and iconic objects that are actually unique across all of the frontiers of the Roman Empire. Now, it might surprise you to know that none of these objects were found in their original contexts on the wall. Many, in fact, were found in the immediate vicinity south of the mural barrier, but others, in fact, were built into boundary walls or gateways of nearby stately homes. One even made its way all the way north to Kincardineshire, where it was embedded into the Great Hall of Dunnottar Castle by the Earls Marshal, and that is a really enigmatic setting just off the northeast coast of Scotland. But that's a whole other story, and we don't have time to cover it today. But conventional wisdom has always been adamant that the distance sculptures record the measurements of the wall, that is, the ramparts construction. But you'll remember I mentioned earlier that the infrastructure of the wall included the military way. Now, the military way is a critical feature of the frontier because it was used to transport troops and supplies along, and I'm quite sure local people may also have used this roadway to navigate the area as well. Why wouldn't they? But I'm also going to suggest, quite controversially, I would say that since only in fact 2 of the distance sculpture make very explicit mention of the wall's construction, in fact I'm going to suggest the distance sculpture might more logically have been placed along the military way. A bit like road markers that we're very accustomed to seeing today, in fact. And I think if I can show you this next image, I stole this from a presentation made by Dutch scholars on a completely different topic recently, but I think it really demonstrates my point very nicely. If we can imagine these Roman soldiers walking along the military way near that border, they are going to encounter, I would suspect, these distance sculptures telling them that the next section of the road that they're walking along was constructed by the 2nd or the 6th or the 20th Legion. So a bit of competition going on there to show you and to show them really what, how much of the frontier each of these legions were building. And in fact, some of the distance sculptures were found very closely together and they had the same distance engraved upon them. But actually, I'm going to suggest that what that might suggest to us is that they were placed back to back, in the same way that if we are crossing maybe the English and Scottish border just now, we will see, or even into a city, you'll see you are just entering Scotland, or you are just entering Glasgow, or you are just leaving. So you, depending on your direction of travel, you would know which section of the wall that you are walking on, and the military way you're walking on was constructed by which legion. So, having now gone over all that background, I think we can potentially return now to the replica distance sculpture from Ferry Dyke at Old Kilpatrick, which is the subject of our talk today. Now, the Antonine wall runs through 5 council areas, and part of the Rediscovering the Antonine Wall project was to replicate distance sculptures from each of these areas with the intention to install them close to the locations where they were originally discovered. I'm pleased to say that they have all now been completed and installed into these areas. So the Old Kilpatrick sculpture was recovered from close to Old Kilpatrick Fort, and that is number 17 on our map here. Now, this really beautifully ornately decorated distance sculpture was donated to the University of Glasgow before 1684, and that was on the death of the 3rd Marquess of Montrose. And as the Marquesses did not own the land in which Old Kilpatrick sits, it may well have come into the Marquesses' possession from a third party, which is quite common for some of the other distance sculptures as well that ended up in the hands of the landed gentry, let's say. So it is recorded as having been located in Mugdock House prior to that house's destruction in the wars of 1640 and before the Marquess's death. Regrettably, because of all of that, the provenance of this distance sculpture is somewhat uncertain because its precise place of discovery is unrecorded, although antiquarians do suggest that it derives from Ferry Dyke on the River Clyde, close to the fort and at the western terminus of the Antonine Wall. Now, in that familiarly prescriptive abbreviated Latin text, the inscription that we have on this particular sculpture translates again to that familiar terminology of for the Emperor Caesar Titus Aelianus Hadrianus Antoninus Augustus Pius, father of his country, a detachment of the 20th Valiant and Victorious Legion built this over a distance of 4,411 units of measure. So very familiar to the other distance sculpture we've talked about today, with a slightly different measurement upon it. Now, the iconography here depicts a reclining winged victory beneath a pediment, as in the triangular top of a temple-like structure, which has fluted pilasters with Corinthian capitals. Now, the goddess here is holding an upright palm frond in her left hand and a large laurel wreath in her right. And that has been used as a panel to hold some of the inscribed text. Her elbow rests on a globe with a crisscross band, and below her an elongated ancient panel, as in with a tablet-like feature, has a legionary symbol of a boar facing leftwards with the measured distance on either side of it. So, a really interesting iconography here, but also very unique in the sense of its articulation of not only the deities and the legionary symbols and religious practice insofar as a temple-like structure and the goddess, but actually the way that the text is displayed and squashed into the pieces is really interesting itself. And although I mentioned the precise spine spot for this particular sculpture is unknown, the reclined position of Victory here has been likened to the pose that's normally adopted by river gods, and that might well refer to its placement close to the River Clyde. And if it does mark the western terminus of the Antonine wall, this could explain its exquisite sculptural detail, I would suggest, and its stylistic composition mirroring these sculptures of river gods. So it's a really beautiful piece in its own right. It also matches the distance on another distance sculpture found close by at Dalnotter Burn, and that is thought to record the completion of a sector of the wall between Dalnotter Burn and Old Kilpatrick Fort. And just out of interest, that sculpture too finds very close stylistic parallels with another of the 20th Legion recovered from Hutchison Hill that was somewhat bizarrely lost in the Great Fire of Chicago in 1871. And that is because the US consul at Newcastle had it shipped there for part of his collection. But that is another story that we don't have time for today. What we see here is in fact yet another replica. That is this time a plaster cast replica that is now on display at the Hunterian Museum, where most of these distance sculptures are on display in their centrepiece exhibit. So I would encourage you to go there if you have the opportunity. So I thought it would be useful to try and understand the creation of this wonderful new sculpture by looking at the phases, stages of its construction. Now, the Old Kilpatrick replica was hand carved by this incredibly talented group of advanced craft apprentice stonemasons from the city of Glasgow College. Now, they were an absolute pleasure to work with in this project, I have to say, and not only did it give these young people the opportunity to work on a unique cultural heritage related project, which is a group that's often quite challenging to reach in heritage related projects, but they were also able to develop and deploy the skills that they were very similar to their Roman stonemason predecessors. So that was really stage one, commissioning these young artists to create the object. So the next task really were to source the sandstone for the sculpture, which was quarried from Witton Fell in North Yorkshire. This is a fine to medium grain blonde stone, which is widely used across the country for its really good responsiveness and durability and excellent carving quality that allows for a really sharp iris. And this is a very similar character to the sandstone used for the original distance sculptures, which was most likely sourced from a very local quarry, possibly from Bishopbriggs, which is a quarry which was used until as late as the 19th century. So this stone is also extensively used, as I say, across Scotland, and it's an excellent raw material for carving because of its fine grain with unique colourings, and it also critically provides a really crisp edge that weathers very well, and it articulates the lettering and iconography quite beautifully. So after that, the next stage was to think about undertaking high resolution scans of the original sculptures in the museum to create 3D prints, and these were very useful tools because they permitted the stonemason students to accurately measure the carved features for size and for depth with great accuracy without risking any negative impact on the originals. So a great kind of way to combine modern technologies and techniques and digital technologies with ancient crafts. And so the next stage was to draw out the features to scale so that they could then be accurately placed and articulated onto these massive stone tablets. And of course, they did this under the expert tuition of Marcus Minimus. He is the Rediscovering the Antonine Wall project's very own stonemason extraordinaire. And so the students were set about crafting this exquisite sculpture under his guidance. So the next part of the process really was the roughing out of the features and letters using various specialist tools, including a mel, which is a round hammer type tool, mel point chisels, tungsten tipped flat chisels, and a scutch, which is a teeth tool. And these are all really relatively unchanged tools from their Roman counterparts, although the mel would have been made from hard wood and the chisels and scutch from fire sharpened mesals. So hand tools were also used for this sculpture, which, although inevitably slower than possibly more modern techniques like laser scanning and laser cutting of the piece, was actually a much preferred methodology because it permitted hand and eye coordination so that the students could discover the forms in a much more organic and natural way. And that in itself produced an effect really much more aligned to the original sculptures. And actually attempts not to overwork the piece left some relatively crude tool marks on the surface, which actually proved quite challenging to these young artists because modern day aesthetics tend to require a much more precise and refined finish. So it really flies against the natural instincts of these artisans to ask them not to refine their surface too much in order to emulate these ancient Roman techniques and make them more authentic like pieces of art. But I think you'll agree the finished product is absolutely spectacular and a real credit to all of those young people and to their lecturers. They've really done a superb job. It's a beautiful piece of art in its own right. And here is the sculpture set into its new position at the Basque Bridge in Old Kilpatrick. It really is a spectacular piece of art, as I say, in its own right, and it's a wonderful, really accessible setting for the local communities and visitors, hopefully from afar, who are encouraged to critically engage with their new sculpture and create their own connections with it through stories yet to be told. And some of these are obviously going to deviate probably quite significantly from the narratives that are imposed often for us by traditional museum displays. As I say, it's a really spectacular piece and it's a wonderful setting so that hopefully people are going to go along and actually create new places and new connections with the object and the settings that they are placed within. Now, I mentioned museum settings, and that's for me a really critical aspect because these new sculptures are unique in that they are not burdened by the restrictions that are quite necessarily imposed in the museum setting. And by that I mean things like lighting, access times, no touching rules, guided content and interpretations, internet access even to engage with the often associated digital content. But even lighting over the course of a day and during the different seasons will transform the way that we experience these sculptures, and the stone's patina, i.e. its surface feel and texture, will alter over time. So again, people are encouraged to have really a tactile, emotional and fully immersive experience and forge new relationships with these sculptures. And I hope in the future potentially to maybe meet some of you as you engage with this and the other replica sculptures along the wall. I'm hoping to at some point undertake some new research into their contemporary performance and reception in the present day, so it'd be really useful to understand your own perspectives as you've engaged with them. So next time you're wandering around your stately home, or indeed any stately home, an old church, an old farm building, any kind of old building or structure, wall, boundary wall, I'd ask you to look quite carefully and check there isn't a Roman distance sculpture embedded into them, because it's, especially in that vicinity, it's not beyond the realms of possibility. So please do give me a call if you come across one. But one final point that I wanted to make and draw your attention to and ask you to think about when you're engaging with and contemplating these things, and also in fact any classical sculpture, whether you're in a museum in Scotland or elsewhere in the future, is to try to look beyond, if you like, that blonde sandstone or marble sculpture, the plain sculpture that you see in front of you, and think of how they might have looked had they been painted in really bright, vibrant colours, as I've been able to demonstrate the originals were. And this is a really nice physical reconstruction, a drawing of how that sculpture from Old Kilpatrick might have looked. And I hope you'll agree, it really brings to life this piece that shows us how that goddess would have looked. Certainly my own work has demonstrated that she would have been cloaked in some way with a white, either a robe or a toga, as we see here. Okay, she's partially naked, which is quite common to Roman or classical statuary in general. But we can see the greens coming out here on the laurel wreath, the reds of the lettering, which is very accurate representation, some browns on the boar, and even a kind of blue background, which is again quite a common feature of these relief sculptures. So really nice interpretation, even down to the gilding at the top of the pillars beside the goddess holding up that temple pediment, and the red architectural painting at the base of them. Again, verifiable types of colours that would have been applied to these types of architectural features, and we still have surviving evidence of that. So, as I say, just think about these things next time you're coming across a plain or well scrubbed classical statue in a museum setting potentially. So I hope you feel encouraged to travel to Old Kilpatrick and experience this sculpture firsthand, and you can do so by following the directions in this really helpful leaflet that's been produced by the Antonine, Rediscovering the Antonine Wall project team. And you can get a bit of information about each of the sculptures there. For the Old Kilpatrick one, for instance, we have a map with a spot indicating where the piece is located, and also some information on how you can travel to see that using various forms of transportation. So again, thank you for joining me. I hope you found today's lecture and the series of lectures we've had all week on these different sculptures as part of the project interesting, and I'm very happy to have a chat or answer any questions you might have about today's sculpture or any that we've covered over the week. Thank you so much.